The cold winds of December 1878 howled through the narrow streets of Helena, Montana, rattling the shutters of Vivian O'Malley's small cabin on the outskirts of town, as she huddled beneath 3 quilts and wept silent tears for her husband, buried just 2 weeks prior, and leaving her alone to face the harshest winter anyone could remember. Vivian struggled to sit upright, her body heavy with grief and the substantial weight she'd carried even before Thomas had succumbed to pneumonia. The fire had died during the night, and the temperature inside the cabin couldn't have been much warmer than outside. Her fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the match as she tried to light the pathetic pile of kindling that remained in the wood box. "Thomas," she whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air, "what am I going to do now?" The O'Malleys had moved to Helena 3 years ago, following the mining boom that had transformed the once small settlement into a bustling town. Thomas had found steady work as a clerk at Holloway's general store, and they'd managed to save enough to build this small cabin. But they'd kept to themselves, Thomas being naturally shy and Vivian uncomfortable with the stares her size inevitably attracted. Now that Thomas was gone, Vivian realized how isolated they'd become. The match flared briefly before dying in her trembling fingers. She tried another and another, until the box was empty and the kindling remained unlit. The cold was seeping into her bones now, and Vivian knew she had no choice. She would have to venture into town for supplies and, most urgently, firewood. Dressing was an ordeal in the freezing cabin. By the time Vivian had wrapped herself in her warmest clothes and Thomas's old coat, the only one that would fit her, she was exhausted. The walk to town, normally 20 minutes, took her nearly an hour through the snow-covered path. Helena's main street was alive with activity despite the cold. Horses and wagons navigated the rutted, icy road while pedestrians hurried along the wooden boardwalks. Vivian made her way to Holloway's general store first, her heart aching at the memories of Thomas that flooded her mind as she pushed open the familiar door. Mr. Holloway was behind the counter, his thin face pinching with recognition as Vivian entered. "Mrs. O'Malley," he said, his voice lacking the warmth it had held when Thomas was alive. "Mr. Holloway," Vivian nodded, catching her breath. "I need to purchase some supplies." "And firewood if you deliver." The storekeeper's eyes darted away. "I'm afraid I can't extend credit anymore, Mrs. O'Malley. Business policy." "I have money," Vivian said, drawing out the small purse she carried. "Thomas left some savings." Holloway nodded, but his expression remained closed. "We're short on firewood. Can't spare any for delivery these days." Vivian glanced around the store, noting the full wood box by the pot-bellied stove. "I can see you have plenty right there, Mr. Holloway." "That's for the store," he said quickly. "I can sell you groceries, but you'll need to find firewood elsewhere." Disheartened but determined, Vivian purchased what supplies she could carry: flour, coffee, salt pork, and beans. As she turned to leave, she overheard Holloway muttering to another customer. Thomas always was soft-hearted, taking on more than he could manage. The words stung as sharply as the cold air that hit her face when she stepped outside. Vivian stood on the boardwalk, clutching her meager purchases, and wondered where to try next. She approached 3 more businesses that sold firewood. At each one, she was met with excuses, averted gazes, or outright refusals. By mid-afternoon, Vivian was exhausted, cold, and no closer to securing the fuel she desperately needed. At the livery stable on the edge of town, she made one last attempt. The stable owner, a grizzled man named Jenkins, at least had the decency to be honest. "Truth is, Mrs. O'Malley, folks don't want to make that trip out to your place. It's a fair distance and with your size." He trailed off, uncomfortable. They figure you'd be better off moving into town or staying with someone who can look after you. I have my home, Vivian said firmly, though her voice wavered. And I can look after myself, I just need firewood. Jenkins shook his head. I'm sorry, I truly am. The walk back to her cabin was even slower than the journey into town. Vivian's feet were numb, her back aching, and tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. When she finally reached the cabin, darkness was settling over the land, and the interior was like an icebox. With trembling hands, she unpacked her purchases and contemplated her options. There were some broken pieces of furniture she could burn, perhaps a few fence posts she might be able to pry loose. She would have to ration carefully and hope for a thaw. Vivian was just about to break apart a wooden chair when a sound outside caught her attention. Horses' hooves and the creak of a wagon, approaching her cabin. Wary but hopeful, she opened the door. A wagon loaded with firewood stood in her yard, and a tall man was already unloading logs. In the fading light, Vivian could make out broad shoulders under a sheepskin coat, a dark beard, and a worn Stetson pulled low over his eyes. "Who are you?" she called, her voice carrying in the still air. The man paused in his work and turned toward her. "Name's Reed Yancy, madam. Heard in town you were needin' firewood." "I can't pay much," Vivian said, wariness mingling with desperate hope. Reed Yancy straightened, a log tucked under each arm. "Not asking for payment, Mrs. O'Malley, just looking to be neighborly." "You're not my neighbor," Vivian said. "I don't believe I've seen you before." "New to these parts," he said, walking toward the cabin. "Got a place about a mile west. Mind if I stack this by your door? Then I'll bring in enough to get your fire going." Too cold and too grateful to refuse, Vivian stepped aside. Reed Yancy worked efficiently, bringing in armloads of wood and arranging them in her nearly empty woodbox. Then he knelt at the hearth and had a fire blazing within minutes. As warmth began to seep into the room, Vivian watched this stranger, this unexpected savior, with confusion and suspicion. Men didn't do kind things for women like her without reason. "Why are you helping me?" she asked directly. Reed stood up from the fire, dusting his hands on his trousers. In the flickering light, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 to her 28, with clear blue eyes that met hers without flinching or the usual discomfort. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I know what it's like to be on the outside." Before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and moved toward the door. "I'll bring more wood tomorrow morning, Mrs. O'Malley. Should keep you warm through the night, though." "Wait," Vivian called. "At least let me offer you some coffee." Reed hesitated, then nodded. "That would be welcome, thank you." While Vivian prepared coffee, Reed stood respectfully by the door, removing his hat to reveal thick brown hair that curled at the edges. He declined her offer to sit, saying he needed to get back to his own place before full dark. As she handed him the steaming mug, their fingers brushed momentarily. Vivian felt a strange flutter in her chest, something she hadn't felt since Thomas had first courted her all those years ago. "Thank you, Mr. Yancy," she said formally, stepping back. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Reed sipped the coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "No repayment necessary, Mrs. O'Malley, but I would consider it a kindness if you'd call me Reed." "Then you must call me Vivian," she replied, surprised at herself. Reed finished his coffee quickly, handed back the cup with a nod of thanks, and put on his hat. "I'll be by in the morning with more wood, Vivian. Keep warm tonight." After he left, Vivian sat by the fire for a long time, watching the flames dance and wondering about Reed Yancy. His kindness seemed genuine, but experience had taught her to be wary. People were rarely kind to women like her without an ulterior motive. Still, as she prepared for bed in the now warm cabin, Vivian found herself looking forward to morning in a way she hadn't since Thomas fell ill. True to his word, Reed arrived the next morning just after dawn, his wagon loaded with fresh-cut firewood. Vivian was already awake, having slept better in the warm cabin than she had in weeks. She had coffee ready when he knocked. "Morning, Vivian," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Brought enough to last you a few days this time." "You really don't need to do this," Vivian said. Though her heart wasn't in the protest, Reed smiled, and she noticed a dimple in his right cheek. "I know, but I'm going to anyway." Over the next hour, Reed unloaded the wagon, stacking the wood neatly along the side of the cabin where it would be protected from the worst of the snow. When he finished, he accepted another cup of coffee and this time, Vivian's invitation to sit at her small table. "You said yesterday you know what it's like to be on the outside," Vivian said carefully. "What did you mean?" Reed's hands, large and calloused, wrapped around the coffee cup. "I was raised by the Blackfoot," he said. "My parents were killed in a raid when I was 4. The tribe took me in, raised me as one of their own." Vivian's eyes widened. "You lived with Indians?" "Until I was 17, Reed nodded. "Then I chose to make my way in the white world. Wasn't easy. People saw me and expected a white man, but I didn't think like one, didn't act like one. Took me years to find a balance." "And now?" Vivian asked. Reed shrugged. "Now I keep mostly to myself. Do odd jobs, some hunting and trapping. Bought a small piece of land last year, building slowly." He paused, then added quietly, "People don't much trust a man raised by Indians." "I understand," Vivian said softly. "People see me and make assumptions too, about my character, my worth, based on nothing but my size." Reed's blue eyes held her steadily. "People are fools, then." The simple statement, delivered without a hint of pity or condescension, brought tears to Vivian's eyes. She looked away quickly, embarrassed. Reed stood, placing his empty cup on the table. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, reaching for his hat. "You don't have to," Vivian protested weakly. "I know," he said again with that same slight smile. "But I will be." And he was. Every morning for the next week, Reed arrived with fresh firewood. Sometimes, he stayed only long enough to unload and have a quick cup of coffee. Other mornings, when the weather was particularly harsh, he lingered longer, fixing loose shingles or mending a broken window latch. Vivian found herself looking forward to his visits, preparing special treats like cornbread or apple dumplings made from her dwindling supplies. They talked easily, sharing stories of their vastly different lives. Reed spoke of his years with the Blackfoot, of the wisdom and kindness he'd found there. Vivian told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 18, and about their dreams of building a life in the West. "Thomas was a good man," she said one snowy morning in late December as they sat by the fire. "He never made me feel like I was, less because of my size." Reed's expression was serious. "Size has nothing to do with worth, Vivian." She laughed softly without humor. "Tell that to Helena." "I would," Reed said, "if I thought they'd listen." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Vivian studied Reed's profile as he gazed into the flames. His face was weathered from years outdoors, with lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. Despite the hardships he described, there was a stillness about him, a sense of being at peace with who he was. "I should go," Reed said eventually, rising from his chair. "Storm's coming in. Might not make it tomorrow if it's bad enough." Vivian felt a disproportionate sense of disappointment. "I understand. You've already done more than enough." At the door, Reed paused. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice casual. "My place is closer to town than yours. If you wanted, I could pick up supplies for you when I go in. Save you the trip." The offer was practical, thoughtful, and Vivian found herself nodding. "That would be very helpful, thank you. Make a list," Reed suggested. "I'll come by day after tomorrow, weather permitting." As promised, Reed appeared 2 days later, having braved the aftermath of the storm to reach her cabin. Vivian handed him a carefully written list and what money she could spare. "I've added something for your trouble," she said. Reed pocketed the list but handed back some of the money. "This is too much, Vivian. I know what things cost. Please," she insisted. "It's only fair." Reed looked as if he might argue further but then nodded. "As you wish." When he returned that evening with her supplies, Vivian invited him to stay for supper. It was a simple meal, rabbit stew and biscuits, but Reed ate with appreciation. "Been a while since I had a home-cooked meal," he admitted, accepting a second helping. "You're a fine cook, Vivian." She flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "My mother taught me." She said a woman who could cook would never lack for friends. "Wise woman," Reed commented. Then, hesitantly, "Would you tell me about your family?" Over the remainder of the meal, Vivian found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years about her parents, her 3 brothers, the small Pennsylvania town where she'd grown up. Reed listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest. "You write to them?" he asked when she finally fell silent. Vivian shook her head. "Not for a long time. My father, he didn't approve of Thomas or of our moving so far away." "That must be hard," Reed said quietly. "Family is important." "It is," Vivian agreed, thinking of her mother's face the last time she'd seen her, tear-stained but trying to be brave. "Maybe someday I'll write again." The evening ended too soon for Vivian's liking. As Reed prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "I was thinking," he said, his voice careful, "there's a social at the church in town on New Year's Eve if you wanted to go." Vivian stiffened. "I don't think that would be wise." Reed's eyes held hers. "Because the town hasn't been kind to you." "Because I haven't been to a social in years," Vivian said, though they both knew it wasn't the whole truth. "And I have nothing suitable to wear." "I understand," Reed said, though disappointment flickered across his face. "Just thought I'd mention it." After he left, Vivian berated herself for her cowardice. Reed had been nothing but kind, and she'd rejected his invitation out of fear of the stares, the whispers, the judgment she knew awaited her in town. But as she prepared for bed, a small, rebellious voice inside her wondered, "What if I went? What if, just for one evening, I stopped hiding?" The thought sustained her through the next day, growing stronger as she went about her tasks. By the time Reed arrived the following morning with more firewood, Vivian had made a decision. "About the social," she said as they sat with their coffee. "If the invitation still stands, I'd like to go." Reed's face lit up with a genuine smile. "It stands." "I'll need to go into town before then," Vivian continued, her courage bolstered by his reaction. "To prepare, I'll take you," Reed offered immediately. "Tomorrow, if that works for you," Vivian nodded, already second-guessing her decision but determined not to back down. "Tomorrow is fine." The trip to Helena the next day was a test of Vivian's resolve. Reed had brought his wagon, helping her up to the seat with a strong hand and careful respect for her dignity. As they approached the town, Vivian felt her anxiety rising. "We don't have to do this," Reed said quietly, sensing her tension. Vivian straightened her shoulders. "Yes, we do." Their first stop was the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Peterson, a thin, pinch-faced woman, looked up from her sewing as they entered, her expression changing from polite inquiry to barely disguised disdain when she recognized Vivian. "Mrs. O'Malley," she said with a nod. "What can I do for you?" "I need a dress," Vivian said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "For the New Year's social." Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted to Reed, who stood quietly by the door, then back to Vivian. "I'm afraid I'm quite backed up with orders," she said. "The social is only a few days away." "I understand it's short notice," Vivian persisted. "I'm willing to pay extra for the rush." The dressmaker hesitated, clearly torn between her distaste and the prospect of additional money. Finally, she sighed. "Very well. Let me see what fabric I have that might suit you." The fitting was a humiliating ordeal. Mrs. Peterson made no effort to hide her disapproval as she took Vivian's measurements, tutting and muttering under her breath. Vivian endured it silently, her face burning with shame but her determination intact. When it was over, and arrangements had been made for Vivian to collect the dress on the morning of the social, she emerged from the shop feeling both victorious and defeated. Reed, waiting patiently with the wagon, took one look at her face and frowned. "That bad?" "Worse," Vivian admitted, but then managed a small smile. "But I've ordered a dress and I'm going to that social." Reed's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Yes, you are." He offered his hand to help her back onto the wagon seat. "Where to next?" They visited several more shops, where Vivian purchased items she hadn't been able to find on her previous trip: better quality flour, some dried fruit, a new pair of gloves. At each stop, she faced varying degrees of coldness or outright hostility, but Reed's presence seemed to temper the worst of it. At Halloway's general store, the proprietor couldn't avoid serving them, but he made it clear through his curt manner that their business wasn't welcome. As they were leaving, Vivian heard him mutter to another customer, "Seems Thomas O'Malley's widow has found herself a new provider." The words, clearly meant to be overheard, stung more than any of the day's earlier slights. Vivian faltered on the threshold, and Reed, walking behind her, placed a gentle hand at the small of her back. "Don't give them the satisfaction," he murmured, guiding her out onto the street. Once they were back in the wagon, Vivian's composure crumbled. "I shouldn't have come," she said, her voice breaking. "This was a mistake." Reed's hand covered hers where it rested on the seat between them. "No, Vivian, the mistake is theirs, not yours." His touch, warm and reassuring, anchored her. Vivian took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Thank you for coming with me today." "I'm honored you asked me," Reed said simply. They drove back to Vivian's cabin in comfortable silence. As they unloaded her purchases, Reed paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision. "Would you like to see my place?" he asked finally. "It's not much, but it's on the way back to town." The invitation surprised Vivian. Despite their growing friendship, Reed had shared little about his current life or home. Curiosity overcame her hesitation. "I would like that," she said. Reed's place turned out to be a sturdy log cabin set in a small clearing, with a creek running nearby and mountains rising in the distance. A corral held 2 horses besides the ones that had pulled their wagon, and a lean-to sheltered what appeared to be a workshop of some kind. "It's not finished," Reed said as he helped Vivian down from the wagon, "but it's coming along." Inside, the cabin was simple but well built. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cooking area nearby. There was a table with 2 chairs, a bed with a colorful Blackfoot blanket, and shelves holding books more than Vivian would have expected. "You built this yourself?" she asked, running a hand along the smooth, plain surface of the table. Reed nodded. "Took me a year." "Still working on a proper bedroom." He gestured to a door that presumably led to the unfinished addition. "And I want to add a porch come spring." "It's wonderful," Vivian said sincerely. Reed's expression softened. "Thank you. It's not much compared to some, but it's mine." As they stood in the center of the cabin, facing each other in the golden afternoon light that streamed through the windows, Vivian felt a shift in the air between them. Reed was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "I should take you home," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Yes," Vivian agreed, though part of her wanted to stay in this peaceful place, with this man who truly saw her in a way no one had since Thomas. The ride back to her cabin was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Reed helped her inside with her purchases, built up her fire, and made sure she had everything she needed before taking his leave. At the door, he paused. "I'll come for you at 6 on New Year's Eve," he said, "if that's all right." "It's all right," Vivian confirmed, her stomach fluttering with both anticipation and dread at the thought of the social. Reed studied her face for a long moment, then reached out to touch her cheek lightly with his fingertips. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle, that Vivian found herself leaning into it before she could think. "Until then," Reed said softly, and was gone. Vivian closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. What was happening to her? Was she truly considering opening her heart again, so soon after Thomas? And to a man who, by his own admission, lived on the fringes of society, just as she did. The days leading up to New Year's Eve passed both too quickly and too slowly. Reed continued his morning visits with Firewood, but there was a new awareness between them, a sense of possibility that both thrilled and terrified Vivian. On the morning of the social, Vivian made the trip into town alone to collect her dress. Mrs. Peterson had done her work well, despite her personal feelings. The dress was a deep burgundy wool, simply cut but flattering, with just enough detail to make it suitable for a special occasion. "It will need to be taken in when you lose weight," Mrs. Peterson remarked as Vivian paid her. Vivian, who had heard variations of this comment her entire adult life, merely smiled. "It's perfect as it is, thank you." Back at her cabin, Vivian spent the afternoon preparing. She bathed using precious heated water, washed and styled her hair, and dressed with care. Looking in her small mirror, she barely recognized herself. The burgundy color brought out the warmth in her brown eyes and complemented her dark hair, which she'd arranged in a becoming style. For the first time in months, Vivian felt something like her old self, the woman she'd been before Thomas's illness, before the town's rejection, before the long, cold days of solitude. When Reed arrived, prompt at 6, his reaction confirmed her efforts had been worthwhile. He stood in her doorway, hat in hand, staring at her with undisguised admiration. "Vivian," he said finally, "you look beautiful." She blushed, taking in his appearance as well. Reed had cleaned up impressively, wearing a dark suit that, while not new, fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was neatly trimmed, his beard combed, and he smelled faintly of soap and something woodsy. "You look quite handsome yourself," she said honestly. Reed smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Shall we?" He offered his arm, and Vivian took it, feeling both terrified and exhilarated as they walked to his wagon. The social was being held in the church hall, a simple building adjacent to Helena's white-steepled church. As they approached, Vivian could hear music and laughter spilling out into the cold night air. Her steps faltered. "We don't have to stay long," Reed assured her, his hand covering hers where it rested on his arm. "Just long enough to show them you're not hiding." Vivian nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. "Let's go in." Their entrance caused a ripple of silence that spread across the hall. Conversations paused, music faltered, and heads turned to stare at the unlikely couple, the overweight widow and the man rumored to have been raised by Indians. Reed, seemingly oblivious to the attention, guided Vivian to a table where refreshments were being served. "Punch?" he asked, as if they were at the most elegant ball in the territory and not being openly gawked at by half the population of Helena. "Yes, thank you," Vivian managed, willing her voice not to shake. As Reed stepped away to get their drinks, Vivian became acutely aware of standing alone in the crowded room. She lifted her chin, refusing to cower, but her heart pounded painfully in her chest. Mrs. O'Malley. Vivian turned to find Mrs. Halloway, the storekeeper's wife, regarding her with surprised curiosity. "Good evening, Mrs. Halloway," Vivian said politely. "We didn't expect to see you here," Mrs. Halloway said. "Not so soon after your loss." The words were sympathetic enough, but the implication was clear. Vivian had no business attending a social event as a recent widow, especially not with another man. "It's been a difficult time," Vivian acknowledged, "but Mr. Yancy kindly offered to escort me this evening. I felt it was time to rejoin the community." Mrs. Halloway's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Yancy?" "Yes, I've heard he's been helping you." Before Vivian could respond to the insinuation, Reed returned with 2 cups of punch. He nodded politely to Mrs. Halloway. "Madam," he said, handing Vivian her drink. Mrs. Halloway's thin smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Yancy, how good of you to bring Mrs. O'Malley this evening. The town has been concerned about her, all alone out there." "Not alone," Reed said mildly. "Just independent, Mrs." Halloway's smile tightened further, and she excused herself to join her husband across the room. "Well done," Vivian murmured, sipping her punch to hide her smile. Reed's eyes twinkled. "I learned a long time ago that people like Mrs. Halloway can only hurt you if you give them the power to do so." As the evening progressed, more people approached them, some out of genuine politeness, others clearly motivated by curiosity or a desire to gather gossip. Vivian found herself relaxing slightly as she realized that while the town might judge her, they couldn't actually harm her. The worst they could do was talk, and they were already doing that. When the small band began playing a waltz, Reed set down his punch cup and turned to Vivian. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked, extending his hand. Vivian hesitated, aware that dancing together would only fuel the town's speculation. But looking into Reed's clear blue eyes, she found she didn't care. "I'd be delighted," she said, placing her hand in his. Reed led her onto the dance floor where several couples were already moving to the music. As they took their positions, Vivian was conscious of the stares, the whispers behind hands. But then Reed's arm circled her waist, his other hand held hers, and they began to move. "I should warn you," Vivian said softly, "I haven't danced in years." "Just follow me," Reed murmured. "I've got you." And he did. Reed led confidently, guiding Vivian through the steps with an ease that made her own movements feel natural. He held her at a respectable distance, but there was an intimacy in the way his eyes never left hers, in the steady pressure of his hand at her back. As they moved around the floor, the whispers and stares faded from Vivian's awareness. There was only the music, the rhythm of their steps, and Reed's unwavering gaze. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked, breathless not from exertion but from the emotions swirling within her. Reed smiled. "The Blackfoot have their own dances, of course. But I learned the waltz in Bozeman years ago. A kind woman took pity on the rough young man I was and taught me." "She taught you well," Vivian said, returning his smile. The music ended too soon, and as they stood facing each other in the center of the floor, Vivian became aware again of the eyes upon them. Some expressions were merely curious, others openly disapproving. Mrs. Peterson, the dressmaker, was whispering something to Mrs. Halloway, both women looking scandalized. "Perhaps we should step outside for some air," Reed suggested, sensing her discomfort. Vivian nodded gratefully, and Reed led her through the crowd to the door. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars blazing in the black sky above. Their breath frosted in the air as they moved away from the building, finding a quiet spot near Reed's wagon. "Are you all right?" Reed asked, his voice gentle in the stillness. Yes, Vivian said, surprised to find it was true. Better than I expected, actually. You were magnificent in there, Reed said, facing them all with such dignity. Vivian laughed softly. I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Reed said. It's facing your fear and doing what needs to be done anyway. My Blackfoot father taught me that. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking up at the stars. Then Reed turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Vivian, he began, I want you to know whatever he was about to say was interrupted by the church hall door opening, spilling light and noise into the night. A group of revelers emerged, laughing and talking loudly. Among them was Mr. Halloway, who spotted Vivian and Reed immediately. Well, well, he called, his voice carrying in the cold air. The widow and the Indian lover, quite a pair you two make. Reed tensed beside Vivian, but his voice remained calm. Mr. Halloway. Enjoying the evening, Halloway, emboldened by drink and the presence of his friends, stepped closer. Not as much as you two, apparently. Tell me, Mrs. O'Malley, what would your dear departed husband think of your friendship with Mr. Yancy here? Vivian felt anger replace her earlier nervousness. Thomas would be grateful that someone showed me kindness when the rest of the town turned their backs, she said clearly. As am I. Halloway sneered. Kindness, is that what they're calling it these days? The man brings you wood every morning. What does he get in return, I wonder? Reed moved so quickly that Vivian barely saw it happen. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he had Halloway by the front of his coat, lifting the smaller man until he was on his toes. Apologize to the lady, Reed said, his voice deadly quiet. Halloway's face paled, his bravado evaporating. I meant no offense, he stammered. Yes, you did, Reed said evenly. Now apologize properly. I'm sorry, Mrs. O'Malley, Halloway said, his eyes darting frantically between Reed's impassive face and his own friends who were making no move to help him. Please, accept my apologies. Reed released him with a slight push and Halloway stumbled backward. Now go back inside, Reed said. And remember your manners in the future. Halloway straightened his coat, his face now red with humiliation. This isn't over, Yancy, he muttered, but he retreated to the hall, his friends following. In the sudden quiet, Vivian placed a hand on Reed's arm. You shouldn't have done that, she said, though she couldn't deny the thrill that had run through her at seeing Reed defend her honor so decisively. Reed's expression was still hard, but it softened as he looked down at her. He insulted you. That's unacceptable. He'll make trouble for you, Vivian warned. Reed shrugged. I'm used to trouble. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. But I'm sorry if I embarrassed you. It wasn't very civilized of me. Vivian squeezed his arm gently. I'm not embarrassed, I'm worried. Halloway has influence in this town. And I have none, Reed acknowledged. But I don't regret what I did, Vivian. No one should speak to you that way. The tenderness in his voice, the protectiveness, stirred something deep within Vivian, a longing she'd thought died with Thomas. Without thinking, she reached up to touch Reed's face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, rough with beard. Reed caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. Vivian, he said, her name almost a prayer in the stillness. The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Reed lowered his head and kissed her. His lips were warm despite the cold air, gentle against hers. Vivian felt herself respond, her free hand moving to his shoulder as she leaned into the kiss. It had been so long since she'd been held, been wanted, and Reed's embrace felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. When they finally parted, Reed rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I've wanted to do that since the first day I brought you wood, he admitted softly. Vivian's heart raced. "Why didn't you?" "It was too soon," Reed said. "You were grieving, and I wasn't sure you could see me that way." "What way?" Vivian asked, though she knew. Reed pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "As a man who could love you, Vivian, who does love you?" The confession, so simply stated, brought tears to Vivian's eyes. "It's too fast," she whispered. "I know," Reed agreed, "and I'll wait as long as you need, but I wanted you to know how I feel." Vivian touched his face again, marveling at the tenderness in his eyes. "I care for you too, Reed. More than I thought possible, but I need time." Reed nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Time you shall have," he promised. "And I'll be here bringing you firewood every morning until you tell me to stop." Vivian smiled through her tears. "Then I suppose you'll be bringing firewood for quite some time." Reed's answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I can think of worse fates," he said, and kissed her again softly, a promise sealed beneath the winter stars. The next morning, Vivian woke to the familiar sound of Reed's wagon approaching. She dressed quickly and had coffee ready when he knocked. "Good morning," she said as she opened the door, suddenly shy after the intimacy of the previous night. Reed's smile was warm as he removed his hat. "Morning, Vivian." They moved through their now established routine, Reed bringing in wood, Vivian pouring coffee, both sitting at her small table, but there was a new awareness between them, a sense of possibilities unfolding. "About last night," Reed began, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. "I meant what I said," Vivian interrupted gently. "I need time, Reed," he nodded. "I understand, and I'll respect that." He paused, then added, "But I meant what I said too, Vivian. My feelings won't change." The certainty in his voice, the steady look in his eyes, made Vivian's heart quicken. "How can you be so sure?" she asked. "You barely know me." Reed considered this, his head tilted slightly. "I know that you face each day with courage despite your grief. I know you make the best corn bread I've ever tasted. I know your laugh is rare but worth waiting for." He reached across the table to touch her hand lightly. "I know enough, Vivian. The rest we can discover together in time." Vivian turned her hand to clasp his. "I'd like that," she admitted. Reed squeezed her hand, then released it and stood. "I should go. I've got work to finish at my place." At the door he paused. Would you consider having dinner with me at my cabin? I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage a decent venison stew." The invitation was significant, and they both knew it a step toward something more than friendship, a formal acknowledgement of their growing feelings. "I'd like that very much," Vivian said. "When?" "Tomorrow evening. I could come for you around 4 before it gets dark." Vivian nodded. "Tomorrow it is." After Reed left, Vivian moved through her day in a daze of conflicting emotions. Was she betraying Thomas by opening her heart to another man so soon? Or would Thomas, who had loved her so completely, want her to find happiness again? The answer came to her as she was preparing for bed, in the form of a memory so vivid it took her breath away. Thomas, in his final days, weak from the pneumonia that would claim him, holding her hand and saying, "Promise me you won't close yourself off, Vive. Promise me you'll live." She had promised through her tears, though at the time she couldn't imagine a life without him. Now, with Reed's gentle persistence breaking through the walls of her grief, Vivian began to understand what Thomas had meant. Living wasn't just surviving day to day. It was allowing yourself to feel, to connect, to love again. The next day dawned clear and cold. Vivian spent the morning cleaning her cabin and the afternoon preparing herself for dinner at Reed's. She chose her second-best dress, a dark blue that Thomas had always liked, and arranged her hair simply but becomingly. Reed arrived promptly at 4, his wagon ready for the short journey to his cabin. As they traveled, He pointed out landmarks and told her stories of the area, how the creek that ran by his property never froze completely, even in the harshest winter. How a family of foxes denned in a hollow near his woodpile. How the mountains looked at sunrise, painted in gold and rose. His cabin, when they reached it, glowed with welcome. Reed had clearly spent time preparing for her visit. A fire blazed in the hearth, the table was set with what appeared to be his best dishes, and the rich aroma of venison stew filled the air. "It's not much," Reed said as he helped her remove her coat, "but I wanted it to be special." "It's perfect," Vivian assured him. Touched by his efforts, they ate by lamplight, the stew as delicious as promised, accompanied by fresh bread that Reed admitted he'd traded for in town. Conversation flowed easily between them, ranging from childhood memories to hopes for the future. "I want to expand the corral," Reed was saying, describing his plans for spring. "Maybe get a few cattle, start a small herd." Vivian listened, enchanted by his enthusiasm. "You love it here, don't you?" Reed nodded, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I've never belonged anywhere as much as I belong here. The mountains, the forests, they remind me of where I grew up with the Blackfoot, but this land is mine in a way nothing else has ever been." He looked at her across the table. I hope someday you might feel the same way about it." The implication was clear, and Vivian felt a flutter of both excitement and fear. "Reed, I'm not asking for anything now," he said quickly. "Just sharing a hope." Vivian reached across the table to take his hand. "It's a beautiful hope," she said softly. After dinner, they sat by the fire, the conversation turning more personal. Reed spoke of his years wandering after leaving the Blackfoot, of the odd jobs he'd taken, the skills he'd learned, the people who'd been kind and those who hadn't. "It was hard at first," he admitted. "I didn't understand white people's ways. I made mistakes, said the wrong things, didn't know how to act. Some folks were patient, others weren't." "But you persevered," Vivian said. Reed smiled slightly. "Didn't have much choice. Couldn't go back to the tribe. That part of my life was over. Had to make my way in this world for better or worse." "And now?" Vivian asked. Reed's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Now I'm exactly where I want to be." The fire crackled between them, shadows dancing on the log walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves of the cabin. "It's getting late," Reed said reluctantly. "I should take you home before the weather worsens." Vivian nodded, though part of her wished to stay in this cozy haven they'd created together. Reed helped her with her coat, his hands lingering briefly on her shoulders. The ride back to her cabin was silent, but comfortably so. When they arrived, Reed insisted on going in first to build up her fire before leaving her for the night. At the door, they stood facing each other, reluctant to part. "Thank you for dinner," Vivian said. "It was wonderful." Reed touched her cheek, his fingers gentle. "Thank you for coming," he said. Then, hesitantly, "May I kiss you good night, Vivian?" In answer, she stepped closer, lifting her face to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Reed's arms went around her, drawing her against him. Vivian felt herself responding with a passion she'd thought long dormant, her hands clutching at the front of his coat. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Reed rested his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to release her. "You should," Vivian agreed, equally reluctant. Reed kissed her once more, briefly, then stepped back. "I'll see you in the morning," he promised. With Firewood, Vivian smiled. "I'll have coffee waiting." As January progressed, a pattern emerged. Reed came each morning with Firewood, stayed for coffee, and often returned in the evening for supper. On days when the weather permitted, they took walks together or visited Reed's cabin, where he showed her his progress on the addition he was building. The town, predictably, buzzed with gossip about the widow O'Malley and the man raised by Indians. Some of it reached Vivian's ears when she ventured into Helena for supplies. Whispers that followed her through the general store, speculative glances from women gathered outside the church. But surprisingly, not all the talk was unkind. Mrs. Peterson, who had been so cold during the dress fitting, stopped Vivian one day to ask, with seemingly genuine concern, how she was managing through the winter. And old Mr. Jenkins at the livery stable actually tipped his hat to her, something he'd never done when Thomas was alive. It seemed that Reed's open devotion to her had changed some people's perceptions. Not everyone's. Certainly Mr. Halloway still treated her with barely concealed contempt, and several of the town's more prominent ladies made a point of crossing the street rather than greet her, but enough that Vivian felt less like an outcast when she visited Helena. One snowy evening in late January, as they sat by the fire in Vivian's cabin after supper, Reed brought up a subject they'd both been avoiding. "Vivian," he said, taking her hand, "I've been thinking about the future, our future." Vivian's heart quickened, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know it's still early," Reed went on, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "And I promised you time, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious. I want to court you properly with the hope that someday you might consider becoming my wife." The words, though not unexpected given the direction their relationship had taken, still took Vivian's breath away. "Reed," she began, but he shook his head. "You don't need to answer now," he said. "I just wanted to be clear about how I feel and what I hope for. Take all the time you need, Vivian. I'm not going anywhere." Vivian looked into his earnest blue eyes and saw the future he was offering: a life together, a shared home, perhaps even children someday. It was more than she had dared to hope for after Thomas's death. "I don't need more time," she said softly. "I know how I feel about you, Reed. I've known for weeks now." Reed's expression was cautiously hopeful. "And how is that?" "I love you," Vivian said, the words both terrifying and liberating. "I didn't expect to love anyone after Thomas. I didn't think it was possible, but you've shown me it is." Reed's face transformed with joy. He gathered her hands in his, kissing them reverently. "Vivian," he breathed. "My Vivian." "Yes," she said, smiling through sudden tears. "Yours." Reed pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I'll make you happy," he promised against her hair. "I swear it." "You already do," Vivian told him, and sealed the promise with a kiss. The following Sunday, they attended church together, a public declaration of their relationship that set tongues wagging throughout Helena. Reed, raised in the spiritual traditions of the Blackfoot but comfortable in the white man's church, sat beside Vivian with quiet dignity, his hand occasionally covering hers on the hymnal they shared. After the service, Pastor Williams approached them in the churchyard, his expression kind but concerned. "Mrs. O'Malley, Mr. Yancy," he greeted them. "I wonder if I might have a word." They followed him to his small office in the church, where he invited them to sit. "I understand," the pastor began carefully, "that the two of you have formed an attachment." "We have," Reed confirmed, his voice even. Pastor Williams nodded, his fingers steepled before him. "While I am, of course, pleased to see Mrs. O'Malley finding comfort after her loss, I must express some concern about the hasty nature of this relationship." Vivian felt a flare of indignation, but Reed's hand on hers kept her silent. "What exactly concerns you, Pastor?" Reed asked mildly. The older man sighed. "To be frank, Mr. Yancy, your background is unusual, and Mrs. O'Malley is still in mourning. The town is talking, and not all of it is charitable." "With all due respect, Pastor," Reed said, his tone still polite but with a core of steel beneath. The town has never been particularly charitable toward either of us. Why should we base our happiness on their approval now?" Pastor Williams looked taken aback, but then a reluctant smile touched his lips. "A fair point, Mr. Yancy." He turned to Vivian. "Mrs. O'Malley, I must ask, are you entering into this relationship of your own free will and with full awareness?" "I am," Vivian said firmly. "Reed has been nothing but honorable and kind. We care deeply for each other, and we intend to build a future together." The pastor studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I wish you both happiness," he said, surprising them. "And if there comes a time when you wish to formalize your union before God, my door is open to you." As they left the church, Reed's arm around Vivian's waist, she marveled at how much had changed in the span of a few short weeks. From the depths of grief and isolation, she had found love, acceptance, and the promise of a new beginning. February brought more snow and bitter cold to Montana, but Vivian hardly noticed the harsh weather. Her days were filled with purpose, now keeping her cabin, preparing meals for Reed, and increasingly helping him with his plans for the spring planting. Reed continued to bring firewood every morning, though now he often stayed for breakfast and returned for supper. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking, rating, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Sometimes Reed would tell stories from his childhood with the Blackfoot, legends and myths that painted vivid pictures of a world Vivian had never known. One evening, as they sat side by side on Vivian's small sofa, Reed tentatively broached a subject they had both been circling. "I've been thinking," he said, his arm warm around her shoulders, "about our living arrangements." Vivian looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "It seems wasteful," Reed continued, choosing his words carefully, "for me to maintain my cabin and you to maintain yours when we spend so much time together anyway." Vivian's heart beat faster. "What are you suggesting?" Reed took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting that perhaps it's time we considered making our arrangement more permanent." "You mean marriage?" Vivian said, wanting clarity. Reed nodded. "Yes, Vivian, I'm asking you to be my wife." Though she had been expecting the proposal, the reality of it still took Vivian's breath away. "Reed," she said softly, turning to face him fully, "are you certain?" "The town, I don't care about the town," Reed interrupted gently. "I care about you, about us. I want to build a life with you, Vivian, if you'll have me." Tears filled Vivian's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you, Reed Yancy." Reed's face lit with such happiness that Vivian's heart seemed to expand in her chest. He cupped her face in his hands, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future shared. "When?" he asked when they finally parted, his eyes never leaving hers. "Soon," Vivian decided. "Before spring planting. There's no reason to wait." Reed nodded, his smile widening. "No reason at all." They were married on the first day of March in a small ceremony in Pastor Williams's study. The only witnesses were the pastor's wife and old Mr. Jenkins from the livery stable, who had surprised them by offering his congratulations when they came to town to obtain the license. Vivian wore her burgundy dress from the New Year's social, with a small bunch of dried lavender at her waist. Reed wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed and his beard combed. As they exchanged vows, Vivian felt Thomas's presence like a gentle benediction, not a haunting, but a blessing. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Pastor Williams said, a genuine smile on his face. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Yancy." Reed's kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise sealed before God and the small company gathered. When they turned to face the witnesses as Mr. and Mrs. Reed Yancy, Vivian felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. The decision to live at Reed's cabin was an easy one. It was larger than Vivian's, with the addition nearly complete, and its location closer to town was more practical. Reed spent the week after their wedding moving Vivian's belongings, furnishing the new bedroom with the bed from her cabin, and making space for her books, dishes, and the few precious mementos she had of Thomas. "There," he said on their first evening in their shared home, his arm around her waist as they surveyed the cabin. "What do you think? Is it home?" Vivian leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of his body against hers. "It's perfect," she said truthfully. "It feels like where I'm meant to be." That night, as they lay together in their marriage bed, Reed's arms around her, Vivian felt a peace she hadn't known since before Thomas fell ill. There was sadness still. Of course she would always miss her first husband, always carry a place for him in her heart, but it no longer overwhelmed her. Instead, it existed alongside her love for Reed, a testament to her capacity to endure, to heal, to begin again. "What are you thinking?" Reed asked, his voice a rumble in the darkness. Vivian traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I'm thinking how blessed I am," she said. "To have known love twice in one lifetime." Reed caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "It is a blessing," he agreed, "one I never expected to find." He pulled her closer, his voice softening. "Sleep now, my love. Tomorrow is a new day." As Vivian drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about all that had brought her to this moment: the grief, the isolation, the cold winter that had seemed endless. And then Reed, appearing like a miracle with an armload of firewood, seeing her when no one else would look, loving her when she thought herself unlovable. The town had refused to help the widow, but in doing so, they had unwittingly given her the greatest gift of all: the chance to find Reed Yancy, to build a life with him, to create a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Spring came early to Montana that year. By mid-March, the snow was melting, revealing patches of mud and the first tentative green shoots. Reed and Vivian worked side by side, preparing the garden plot, mending fences, and planning for the small herd of cattle Reed hoped to acquire. Word of their marriage had spread through Helena, eliciting reactions that ranged from genuine congratulations to open disapproval. But increasingly, as the couple made their weekly trips to town for supplies, they found people warming to them. Mrs. Peterson, the dressmaker, stopped Vivian to compliment her on how well married life suited her. Old Mr. Jenkins tipped his hat to Reed and asked about his plans for the property. Even Mr. Halloway, while not exactly friendly, had ceased his open hostility, perhaps mindful of Reed's previous confrontation. One April morning, as they sat on their newly built porch watching the sunrise paint the mountains in gold and pink, Reed reached for Vivian's hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "about family." Vivian turned to look at him, her heart quickening. "Oh," Reed's eyes, so clear and blue in the morning light, held a mix of hope and uncertainty. "I know we haven't discussed it much, but would you want children, Vivian?" "With me?" The question, so simply asked, brought tears to Vivian's eyes. She had always wanted children, had dreamed of them with Thomas, but it had never happened. At 38, she had thought that dream might be past. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I would love to have children with you, Reed." The joy that spread across Reed's face was like sunrise breaking. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "I wasn't sure," he admitted against her hair. "I didn't want to assume." Vivian pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his beloved face. "I've always wanted to be a mother," she told him. "I just wasn't sure if it was still possible for me." Reed's expression was tender as he brushed a tear from her cheek. "We'll see what blessings come our way," he said. "And if they don't, we have each other. That's more than enough." But blessings did come their way. By June, Vivian was certain she was with child. The town doctor confirmed it, his initial surprise giving way to genuine happiness for the couple. "Due in early January by my calculations, doctor," Bennett said. "A new year, a new life." Reed, waiting anxiously outside the examination room, swept Vivian into his arms when she emerged with the news, heedless of the doctor's amused expression. "Careful," Dr. Bennett cautioned with a smile. "Mrs. Yancy needs to take things easy, especially given her condition." Reed set Vivian down gently but kept an arm around her waist. "We'll be careful," he promised. "I'll make sure of it." The pregnancy wasn't easy. Vivian's age and size made for discomfort and concern, but Dr. Bennett monitored her closely, and Reed was attentive to her every need. By autumn, Vivian's belly was round and firm, the child within active and strong. "A boy," Reed predicted one evening as they sat by the fire, his hand resting on Vivian's stomach to feel the baby kick. "A strong son." "Or a daughter," Vivian countered with a smile. "With your eyes and my stubbornness." "God help us all," Reed laughed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. As winter approached again, Reed worked tirelessly to prepare for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from pine, carving Blackfoot symbols of protection into the headboard. He stocked firewood until the pile was higher than the cabin's windows. He made trip after trip to town for supplies, ignoring the curious stares and whispers that still sometimes followed him. The first snow fell in late November, earlier than the previous year. As Vivian watched the white flakes drift past the window, she felt a sense of completion, of cycles turning. A year ago, she had been alone, widowed, cold, and afraid. Now she sat in a warm cabin, loved and loving, with new life growing within her. "What are you thinking?" Reed asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms encircling her and their unborn child. Vivian leaned back against him, secure in his strength. "I was thinking about last winter," she said. "About how cold I was, how alone, and then you came with firewood." Reed's arms tightened around her. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured against her hair. "Why did you do it?" Vivian asked, a question she had wondered about but never directly asked. "That first day, why did you help me when no one else would?" Reed was quiet for a moment, considering. "I heard talk in town," he said finally. "About the widow O'Malley out on the edge of town, too big to fend for herself, too proud to ask for help. Some were laughing about it. Holloway was one of them." Vivian winced, but Reed continued. "It made me angry," he said. "I know what it's like to be judged for things you can't control, to be on the outside. So I loaded up my wagon and headed out to your place." He turned her in his arms, his expression serious. "But when you opened that door, Vivian, when I saw you standing there so brave and so alone, I didn't feel pity. I felt admiration. And something else, something I wasn't ready to name yet." "Love," Vivian suggested softly. Reed smiled, touching her cheek gently. "Maybe the beginning of it," he agreed. "I just knew I wanted to see you again, needed to somehow." "So you brought firewood the next day," Vivian said. "And the next. And I'll keep bringing it," Reed promised, "for as long as you'll have me." Vivian rose on tiptoe to kiss him, her belly pressing against his. "Forever, then," she whispered against his lips. "That's how long I'll have you, Reed Yancy." Christmas came and went. A quiet celebration in their cabin with a small tree Reed had cut and decorated with paper stars Vivian had folded. They exchanged simple gifts, a knitted scarf from Vivian to Reed, and from Reed to Vivian, a silver locket containing a lock of his hair, a Blackfoot tradition he had explained with uncharacteristic shyness. As the new year approached, Vivian grew increasingly uncomfortable. The baby had dropped lower, making breathing easier but walking more difficult. Dr. Bennett, visiting the cabin twice a week now, predicted the child would arrive before the year's end. He was right. On the evening of December 30, 1879, as the year's final snowstorm raged outside, Vivian felt the first pains. Reed, who had scarcely left her side in the past week, immediately hitched the wagon to go for the doctor, but Vivian grabbed his arm. "There's no time," she gasped as another pain seized her. "The baby's coming now." Reed's face paled beneath his tan, but he nodded. "Tell me what to do," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. What followed were the most intense hours of Vivian's life. The pain was tremendous, but Reed was her anchor, his presence unwavering, his hands gentle as he helped her through each contraction. He had assisted with births among the Blackfoot, he told her, but never as the sole attendant, never with someone he loved. "You're doing so well," he murmured, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "So brave, my Vivian." When the final moments came, Reed positioned himself to catch the baby, his face a study in concentration and awe. "Push now," he urged. "Push, my love." With a final, tremendous effort, Vivian felt the baby slip from her body into Reed's waiting hands. There was a moment of terrible silence, and then the most beautiful sound Vivian had ever heard, the strong, indignant cry of their child. "A boy," Reed announced, his voice breaking with emotion. "We have a son, Vivian." He placed the squalling infant on Vivian's chest, and she looked down into a tiny red face perfect in every detail. "Hello," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Hello, little one." Reed sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Vivian, one hand gently touching his son's head. "He's beautiful," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Perfect." "Thomas," Vivian said, looking up at her husband. "Thomas Reed Yancy, if that's all right with you." Reed's eyes, bright with unshed tears, met hers. "It's more than all right," he said. "It's perfect." After completing the necessary tasks of childbirth, cutting the cord, delivering the afterbirth, cleaning the baby, Reed settled Vivian and their son comfortably in bed. Then he built up the fire until the cabin was warm as summer, heated water for tea, and sat beside his wife and child, unwilling to let them out of his sight. "I never knew," he said softly, watching as the baby nursed at Vivian's breast, "that it was possible to love someone so much so instantly." Vivian smiled tiredly. "It's overwhelming, isn't it?" Reed nodded, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. Little Thomas's fingers immediately curled around his father's thumb, holding with surprising strength. "Look at that grip," Reed said with pride. "He's going to be strong like his mother." "And wise like his father," Vivian added. They sat in peaceful silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire, the howling of the wind outside, and the occasional soft noise from the nursing baby. "A year ago today," Reed said eventually, "I was alone in my cabin, wondering what the new year would bring." He looked at Vivian, his eyes full of love. "I could never have imagined this." "Nor I," Vivian agreed, shifting the now sleeping baby to her shoulder. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over. I never dreamed it was just beginning." Reed leaned forward to kiss her gently, then pressed another kiss to his son's downy head. "Happy New Year, my loves," he whispered as the clock on the mantel struck midnight. Outside, the storm began to abate, snow settling softly on the landscape, covering all in a blanket of pristine white. Inside, the Yancy family slept peacefully in the warm cabin, the fire burning bright in the hearth, a testament to the love that had begun with a simple act of kindness, an armload of firewood on a cold winter morning. In the years that followed, Reed continued to bring firewood to the cabin every morning, even after they had added 2 more children to their family, a daughter, Sarah, born in 1881, and another son, James, in 1883. It had become a ritual, a daily reminder of how their love story had begun. The town of Helena gradually accepted the Yancy family. Reed's skills as a horseman and tracker earned respect, while Vivian's kind heart and delicious baking won over even some of her former detractors. Young Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle spirit, a bridge between two worlds, just as his parents had been. And each winter, when the snow fell and the world turned white, Vivian would stand at the window watching Reed stack firewood against the coming cold, her heart full with the knowledge that sometimes life's greatest blessings come from its deepest sorrows, and that love, true love, sees beyond the surface to the person within. For in the end, it wasn't just firewood that Reed Yancy had brought to Vivian's door that cold December morning. It was hope, and a second chance at happiness, gifts more precious than any gold in Montana's hills, gifts that would warm their hearts through all the winters of their lives together.